At 9 o'clock on the morning of October 12, 1776, roughly 4,000 British troops began landing behind George Washington's army. 5 miles ahead was King's Bridge, the critical route connecting Manhattan with the mainland. If General William Howe reached it fast enough, Washington could find his army trapped between British infantry and rivers patrolled by the Royal Navy. There was almost nothing standing in Howe's way. Almost. At a narrow crossing over Westchester Creek, about 25 American riflemen were waiting. The bridge in front of them had been stripped of its planks. Behind it lay a pile of cordwood, and behind that pile, Colonel Edward Hand's men raised their rifles as the head of the British column appeared. Within minutes, the advance stopped. 4,000 professional troops, supported by the most powerful military system on Earth, had reached a position defended by roughly 25 Americans and could not simply move past them. The British had not been defeated. Their army was still intact. Their officers were experienced. Their artillery was coming ashore, and reinforcements could follow. But somehow, the size of Howe's force had stopped mattering. And the reason why would turn a small bridge on the edge of New York into one of the clearest examples of how terrain can make an enormous army temporarily useless. The danger was much bigger than the firefight itself. For weeks, Howe had been trying to solve the same problem. George Washington refused to give him the decisive battle Britain wanted. The British had already smashed the Americans on Long Island. They had taken New York City. At Kip's Bay, British troops had landed on Manhattan and sent American defenders running. Washington still had an army, but much of that army was now concentrated in the northern part of Manhattan around Harlem Heights. Howe could attack those positions directly. He did not need to. The geography around New York gave Britain something almost as valuable as another army: ships. Manhattan was surrounded by waterways, and the Royal Navy could move soldiers around Washington faster than Washington could move large formations overland. Again and again, British commanders could threaten one position from the front while putting troops ashore somewhere behind it. That was the logic behind Throg's Neck. Howe would leave enough troops facing Washington on Manhattan to hold his attention. Meanwhile, thousands of soldiers would embark in flatboats and other small craft, move up the East River, pass through the dangerous waters of Hell Gate, and land northeast of the American position. From there, they could drive inland toward King's Bridge. On a map, it was elegant. If British troops seized that crossing before Washington could withdraw, the American commander would face a nightmare. Enemy troops would be in his rear. The Royal Navy controlled the waterways on either side. His communications with Connecticut could be threatened. A retreat could become a race through narrowing corridors, with British columns closing from several directions. Howe did not need to destroy Washington at Harlem Heights. He needed to get behind him, and on October 12th, the British were about to try. The operation began before dawn. Around 3 in the morning, between 4,000 and 5,000 soldiers started embarking from the East River area. Guards, regular infantry, artillerymen, light troops, the kind of force capable of establishing a beachhead and then expanding it rapidly. Almost immediately, the water began fighting them. A heavy fog settled over the river while a strong ebb tide pulled at the boats. Hell Gate was notorious for violent currents, and most of the soldiers and boat crews moving through it had little experience with the passage. One artillery flatboat overturned while being towed. 3 6-pounder guns went into the water. 4 artillerymen drowned. It could have been far worse. The Royal Navy got the force through. By about 9 o'clock, the British began landing at Throg's Neck, with no serious opposition on the beach itself. So far, Howe's plan was alive. Then his soldiers started moving inland, and they discovered what their maps had failed to make obvious. Throg's Neck was called a neck because it appeared to be a peninsula, but at high tide, the wetlands and creeks around it made the position behave much more like an island. The British had landed thousands of men on ground, from which there were very few useful exits. For infantry moving in formation, for artillery teams dragging guns, for officers trying to keep units organized, the important question was not how much land existed around them. It was where solid roads crossed the water and marsh. And one of the most important crossings was the bridge over Westchester Creek. That was where Edward Hand was waiting. Hand was an unusual man to find blocking a British army. He had been born in Ireland and trained in medicine. Before the Revolution, he had served as a surgeon's mate in the British Army itself. He left that service, settled in Pennsylvania, and when the war began, joined the Continental cause. By 1776, he commanded the 1st Continental Regiment, a force heavily associated with Pennsylvania riflemen. These were not ordinary smoothbore musketeers. Their long rifles could be extremely accurate at distances where standard infantry muskets became far less reliable. The trade-off was important. Rifles loaded more slowly, lacked the bayonet advantage of standard military muskets, and were not ideal weapons for standing in formation against a bayonet charge. Handsmen were most dangerous when they had distance, cover, and freedom to choose their shots. At Westchester Creek, they had all three. Major General William Heath had already understood how vulnerable this crossing was. He kept a small picked detachment watching the bridge and ordered that if the British landed, the planks were to be removed. When the alarm came, the Americans did exactly that. Hand's riflemen tore up the bridge surface, then took position near the western end using a long pile of cordwood as cover. This was not a fortress. There were no massive earthworks, no stone bastions, no ditch filled with sharpened stakes, just a broken bridge, marshy ground, wood stacked near the road, and roughly 25 men with rifles. Then the British column appeared. The Americans opened fire. And here is where the numbers become misleading, because the fight was never really 25 men against 4,000 men. 4,000 British soldiers had landed at Throg's Neck. But 4,000 soldiers could not simultaneously reach the bridge. The men behind the first British ranks could not shoot through the men in front of them. Artillery could not simply roll across marshland wherever its crews wanted. Infantry formations designed to maneuver on open ground had to compress toward the few usable approaches. At the point of contact, Britain's overwhelming numerical superiority was trapped behind its own vanguard. The battlefield had reduced an army into a queue. That was the first reason 25 riflemen could matter. The second was that they did not need to win. Hand's men were not trying to destroy Howe's invasion force. They did not need to hold the position forever. They did not even need to prevent the British from ever reaching the mainland. Their job was much smaller. Make the first British troops stop. Make officers assess the crossing. Make artillery come forward. Make the enemy search for another route. Buy minutes, then buy more. Because every minute that disappeared at Westchester Creek could be used somewhere else by the Americans. The initial British reaction was not cowardice, and it was not incompetence. Professional officers encountering a demolished bridge under accurate rifle fire do not gain anything by throwing men blindly into water simply to prove that they are brave. The British pulled back toward higher ground. But Howe had not transported thousands of troops through Hellgate to be stopped by 25 Americans. There had to be another way out. There was. Farther along the creek was a ford. If British troops could cross there, the bridge would become irrelevant. Hand's little position could be bypassed, the road network could be opened, and Howe could continue toward Washington's rear. So the British shifted attention toward the second passage, and found Americans there too. This changes the story. The famous version is 25 riflemen behind a woodpile stopping a British army at one bridge. That image is real enough to survive because it captures the absurdity of the moment. But the actual military mechanism was larger than a single bridge. The bridge was part of a system, a creek, tidal marsh, a damaged causeway, a ford that could be defended, stone walls running across the surrounding fields, roads narrow enough to channel movement, ground that made it difficult to bring artillery into action wherever Howe wanted. The Americans did not need to defend every yard of Throg's Neck. They only needed to control the places where thousands of men could turn from a landing force into an advancing army. The British had successfully crossed miles of water. Now they were struggling to cross the final few yards that mattered, and both sides understood that this situation could not remain static. Howe could bring more troops forward. The Americans could bring more troops forward too. That created a race. Hand's 25 riflemen had accomplished the first task. They had prevented the British advance guard from taking the crossing immediately. Now they needed help before the British found enough force, enough artillery, or enough room to break through. William Heath responded fast. Colonel William Prescott's Massachusetts Regiment was ordered toward the causeway with artillery support. Prescott was not an anonymous militia officer. He was the veteran who had commanded American troops in the redoubt at Bunker Hill the year before. Another American force moved to reinforce the upper crossing at the head of the creek. More units followed. What began as a tiny picket turned into a real defensive screen. Another 1,500 or so American infantry came into the area. Estimates of the defenders grew toward roughly 1,800 men covering the approaches. That number matters because it explains what the original 25 actually accomplished. They did not hold 4,000 British troops alone for 6 straight days. They did something more believable and more useful. They kept the door shut long enough for 25 men to become hundreds, and then for hundreds to become a force large enough to make reopening that door expensive. This is one of the basic realities of delaying warfare. A small unit does not need enough strength to defeat the enemy's entire army. It needs enough strength to interfere with the enemy's timetable until something else changes. At Throg's Neck, everything began changing. American guns came into position. Small defensive works appeared near the passages. Troops used stone fences and the broken terrain for cover. Washington himself examined the situation and immediately recognized why the ground favored the defense. Stone walls crossed the roads and fields. Large formations would have difficulty advancing in regular order away from the main road. Artillery mobility was restricted. What had looked like an open route into Washington's rear was becoming a funnel lined with defensive positions. The British brought guns toward the bridge. They had the power to force the issue eventually. That distinction is crucial. Nothing about Hand's position made it physically impossible for the British Army to break out. If Howe had been willing to concentrate infantry, engineer a crossing, pound American positions with artillery, accept casualties, and push hard enough, the Americans could not reasonably expect 25 riflemen, or even the reinforcements behind them, to resist the full weight of the British Army indefinitely. But Howe's objective was not the heroic capture of Westchester Creek. His objective was speed. He was trying to outmaneuver Washington. That meant every hour spent preparing a deliberate assault was already damaging the purpose of the operation. This is the paradox at the center of Throg's Neck. The stronger Howe became at the landing site, the less valuable the original maneuver became. More guns required time, more troops required space. More supplies required unloading. A deliberate attack required reconnaissance and coordination, and all of those things consumed the one resource Howe could not recover: time. The British could probably take the bridge, but taking the bridge tomorrow was not the same as crossing it this morning. The entire plan depended on reaching Washington before Washington could react. Hand was not really defending a pile of wood. He was attacking the British schedule. By October 13th, Heath was writing to Washington that American readiness at the bridge and the pass over the marsh appeared to have disappointed the enemy. That language tells us what mattered: not annihilation, not a battlefield victory in the traditional sense. Disappointment, delay. The British had arrived expecting movement and instead were forced to reconsider. The position was reinforced further, and neither side had any reason to misunderstand the danger. For the Americans, a British breakthrough still threatened catastrophe. Washington's army had already survived one near encirclement on Long Island. In August, British troops had turned the American flank, and only a desperate nighttime evacuation across the East River had saved thousands of men from capture. Washington had learned what British mobility around New York could do. Now, Howe was trying something similar on a larger geographic scale. Washington could not assume that Throg's Neck would hold forever. He also could not abandon Manhattan casually. Fort Washington still guarded the Hudson. Supplies, artillery, soldiers, roads, and positions all had to be considered. An army does not disappear from one defensive line and instantly materialize 20 miles away. Movement takes wagons, horses, orders, columns stretching along roads, units waiting for other units to clear intersections, men who become separated. Food that must follow, cannons that move at the pace of teams dragging them, and while all of that happens, the enemy is still moving too. This is why a small delay at a creek could have consequences far beyond the men firing the first shots. The Americans needed decision time. Throg's Neck gave them some. But then another factor intervened: weather. Severe autumn storms complicated British movement and prevented an immediate re-embarkation once Howe decided that forcing the Throg's Neck position was not the best solution. The British were not simply standing helplessly for 6 days because 25 riflemen kept firing at them. The first American check had exposed the weakness of the landing site. Reinforcements made the exits more difficult. Then, weather and the logistics of shifting a large amphibious force extended the interruption. The result was the same from Washington's point of view. The British maneuver had lost momentum. Howe had come to Throg's Neck to transform mobility into encirclement. Instead, thousands of British soldiers were concentrated on ground that did not let them exploit their numbers efficiently. And the obvious solution was becoming unavoidable. Leave, not retreat from the campaign, not abandon the flanking operation, simply get back into the boats, move north, and choose a better landing site. The British had the Navy. They still had operational mobility. If one doorway was blocked, they could sail to another. The next target was Pell's Point, only about 3 miles north. That sounds like a small adjustment. On a modern map, it barely looks like a change. For an 18th century army, it meant reorganizing an amphibious operation while the enemy was already reacting. And the Americans were not waiting passively. On October 16th, Washington gathered his senior commanders. The strategic situation had become impossible to ignore. British warships had demonstrated that the Hudson defenses could not reliably prevent naval passage. Howe had put major forces behind the Continental position. Holding northern Manhattan with the main army risked exactly the kind of entrapment Washington had feared. The choice was no longer whether the British maneuver was dangerous. The choice was what Washington was willing to abandon to save the army. The decision was made to evacuate most of Manhattan and shift northward toward White Plains, while leaving a garrison at Fort Washington. It was not a glorious decision, it was survival. And survival was what Howe's original landing had been designed to prevent. This is where those first minutes at the bridge become more important. Imagine the British column had reached Westchester Creek before the bridge was stripped. Imagine the crossing had been intact. Imagine the advance guard had pushed through immediately, secured the roads beyond, and opened space for the formations behind it. The precise outcome cannot be known. Washington might still have escaped. American troops might have formed another defensive line. Howe might still have moved cautiously. History does not allow us to replay the operation with one variable changed, but we do know what Howe wanted. He wanted rapid access to Washington's rear and the roads linking the Americans to the mainland. And we know what happened instead. The advance stopped at the passages. The Americans reinforced them. Howe had to change the landing site. Days disappeared. Washington used those days to confront the danger and prepare movement north. Then, before dawn on October 18th, the British operation started moving again. Troops boarded flatboats and bateaux. The force shifted north toward Pell's Point at the mouth of the Hutchinson River. This time, the landing ground was better. Henry Clinton and Charles Cornwallis, two of the most experienced British commanders in North America, directed the operation. Light infantry, grenadiers, and dismounted light dragoons led the force ashore. Around 4,000 men were again moving inland. The Throg's Neck problem had been solved, but the delay had created another problem. The Americans now knew exactly what kind of operation Howe was conducting, and waiting near the new route was Colonel John Glover. Glover had about 750 Continental soldiers from Massachusetts. He could not defeat Howe's force in a conventional battle, so he did not try. He looked at the road. He looked at the stone walls crossing the countryside, and he built another machine for consuming British time. Glover divided his troops into successive positions behind the walls along the road. Instead of creating one line that the British could smash with a concentrated attack, he created several. The first American position would fire, then withdraw. The British would reorganize, advance, and reach another wall, another volley, another withdrawal. Then another position. The concept was brutally simple. Make the British repeatedly perform the slowest part of 18th century combat. Find the enemy. Deploy, form, attack, drive him away, reform, march again. A professional army could do all of those things. That was precisely why the British were dangerous. But professionalism did not eliminate time. Every American line forced Howe's troops to spend more of it. At Pell's Point, Glover turned stone walls into a sequence of breaks. The fighting became far more serious than the opening shots at Throg's Neck. British and Hessian troops pressed forward. The Americans fired from cover and fell back in stages. When Cornwallis threatened Glover's flank, the American colonel recognized that the delaying action had reached its limit and withdrew across the Hutchinson River. Glover had not defeated the British. Again, that was not the mission. He had made them slower. The Americans lost men. British and Hessian casualties were also suffered, though exact totals remained disputed in different accounts. What was not disputed was the strategic effect. Glover's brigade bought additional space and time for Washington's main army moving toward White Plains. And now, the pattern becomes impossible to miss. At Throg's Neck, 25 men stopped the first breakout. Reinforcements turned the crossings into defended positions. Howe loses the landing site and shifts north. At Pell's Point, 750 Americans make the replacement route costly and slow. At the same time, Washington's army is moving away from the trap. This was not one dramatic victory. It was a chain of delays, and every delay transferred advantage from the side that needed speed to the side that needed survival. The British eventually advanced beyond Pell's Point. Howe had not been defeated strategically. He still commanded a powerful army, and within days he would bring around 13,000 British and German troops against Washington near White Plains. On October 28th, the two armies fought there. The British turned the American right and took Chatterton Hill. Washington eventually withdrew again. A few weeks later, the disaster at Fort Washington would prove just how dangerous British power remained. The garrison left behind on Manhattan was overwhelmed, and thousands of American troops were captured. So Throg's Neck cannot honestly be presented as the moment Washington won the New York campaign. He did not. The British continued to win ground. They continued to force retreats. They continued to exploit naval superiority. But the operation that landed at Throg's Neck had a more specific purpose than simply gaining ground. It was an attempt to get behind Washington fast enough to constrict his choices, and that is the part that failed. Not because 4,000 British soldiers were weaker than 25 American riflemen. Not because Howe's officers forgot how to fight. Not because the Continental Army suddenly became superior. The operation failed at its most delicate point, the transition from water to land. An amphibious army can appear terrifying on a map. Ships can carry thousands of men around an enemy flank faster than those men could march there. But ships do not capture roads. Infantry does. And before infantry can exploit a landing, it has to get off the beachhead, through the exits, onto usable roads, with enough room to form and enough artillery and supplies to keep moving. At Throg's Neck, the British had crossed the East River. They had passed Hell Gate. They had landed successfully. They had put roughly 4,000 men behind Washington. And then all of that strategic mobility narrowed into a damaged crossing over a marshy creek. That was the hidden weakness. The Royal Navy could move an army around Manhattan. It could not make Westchester Creek disappear. Howe could land 4,000 soldiers. He could not make 4,000 soldiers fit through one narrow approach at the same moment. British artillery was powerful. It still needed firm ground and room to move. British infantry was disciplined. It still needed space to deploy. And every soldier standing behind the front ranks added to the army's total strength without adding very much to the amount of force that could immediately be applied at the crossing. For a short period of time, Hand had done something extraordinary. He had separated British strength on paper from British strength at the point of contact. That is how 25 men could stop thousands, not by matching them, by making most of them irrelevant. The bridge itself was not magical. If the surrounding ground had been dry and open, Howe could simply have moved around it. If the ford had been unguarded, he could have bypassed it. If Hand's riflemen had fired too early and fled before the bridge was disabled, the British advance might have continued. If American reinforcements had arrived hours later, the initial delay might have meant nothing. The effect came from several things working together. The tide restricted the ground. The creek and marsh restricted the routes. The Americans disabled the best crossing. The riflemen covered it from a protected position. Another detachment controlled the ford. Reinforcements arrived before the British could convert their numerical superiority into a clean breakthrough. Stone walls strengthened the country behind the crossings. Then, weather and the difficulty of relocating a large landing force consumed still more time. No single element stopped Howe. Together, they broke the timing of his maneuver. and that is the detail the title of this story can easily hide. 25 Americans did not trap 4,000 British soldiers in the sense of surrounding them and forcing a surrender. They trapped the first British advance inside a geographic bottleneck. They made a force of thousands behave like a force of dozens at the exact point where the campaign required rapid movement. Then, they held that bottleneck long enough for the situation to change. By the time Howe had a better road, Washington had a better chance. By the time the British landed at Pell's Point, Glover was waiting. By the time Howe continued toward White Plains, the main Continental Army was no longer sitting exactly where the original plan had expected to catch it. The British eventually escaped the problem at Throg's Neck. What they could not recover was the calendar. That is why this tiny action matters. Military history is full of battles where victory is measured by bodies, guns, and captured ground. Throg's Neck shows a different kind of mathematics. A weaker force does not always need to destroy a stronger one. Sometimes it needs to identify the one place where the stronger force cannot use everything it has. A doorway, a mountain pass, a ford, a causeway, a bridge. Then the question changes. Not, can 25 men defeat 4,000? They obviously cannot. The useful question is, how many of those 4,000 can actually reach the 25 at once? At Westchester Creek, the answer was small enough. And for Washington, small enough was all that mattered. Edward Hand would continue fighting after New York. A few months later, his riflemen would again become specialists in delay, harassing British forces during the Trenton campaign and helping consume the hours Washington needed. There was a pattern in Hand's usefulness. He was not famous because he destroyed enormous enemy formations. He was useful because he understood what small formations could do when destruction was impossible. Force the enemy to deploy, force him to hesitate, force him to protect his front, make him believe the road ahead will cost more time than expected. Then move before he can bring his full weight down. At Throg's Neck, that principle appeared in almost perfect form. Howe arrived with ships, artillery, professional infantry, and thousands of men. Hand had 25 riflemen, a dismantled bridge, and the right piece of ground. The British still possessed almost every advantage that mattered in a normal battle. But this was not yet a normal battle. First, they had to get through the door, and 25 Americans had closed it. If you enjoy military history where the real answer is not simply who had more men or bigger guns, subscribe. And tell us in the comments, if you had been William Howe at Throg's Neck, would you have forced the crossing immediately and accepted the casualties, or was abandoning the position and searching for a better landing site the correct decision?